one of the things we know from business strategies is that only 30% of business strategies are actually successfully executed. And of those that are, most CEOs think they're too slow. So the world generally thinks, well, why don't I just think of something logical, I'll put it on a piece of paper, and once it's on a piece of paper, I'll follow it, and then I'll reach the result, and we'll get to our goal. And there are smart people in business. So why is it that when you think of something logical and you put it on paper and you follow it, only 30% of them are actually successfully executed? Now, one of the things we know is that when you're making strategic decisions, it involves both conscious and unconscious factors. And once you have an understanding of the unconscious factors, it can actually improve the way in which you make strategic decisions. Now, what specific things within business can actually be helped, and how does brain science help? Well, the first thing is that brain science can help take something that you've already been talking about in one kind of language, like if you've been talking about how do we get to the finish line faster, or how do we increase our sales, and you can change it into a brain science language. Like, instead of saying how do we get to the finish line faster, how can we make decisions more effectively so that we actually get to the finish line faster? So it changes the kind of conversation, and so the message that's being sent to your brain is actually different. So at the most superficial level, it actually provides you a different kind of language. Secondly, with regard to that language, it provides you a language that people can hold on to. So for a lot of people, there are soft variables that significantly impact business success. Things like trust, things like empathy, things like communication. And what brain science does is, for a lot of people in business, they're very practical. So when you start talking to them about empathy and trust, they phase out because they can't really hold on to it because it's too abstract. And what the brain science does, instead of talking about empathy, we talk about specific systems called mirror neuron systems. And instead of my saying, I am empathizing with you, what I would say is, when you have a certain expression on your face, there's an actual mirror in my head that mirrors what the expression is in your face. And we can talk later, if you'd like, about why it's significant within business. The third thing, which I think is one of the most important things, is what I referred to earlier, which is that the brain science provides specific insights into the unconscious. So one glaring example is, and I think this is particularly true in Greece, is that we know that decision-making is very significantly influenced by emotions.
Yeah.
And one strong emotion is fear. And fear and uncertainty both impact the brain in very significant ways. Now, if we just relied on feeling afraid or shivering or feeling some kind of physical sensation of fear, that would be fine. But the problem is that fear can be unconscious. You can be completely unaware of it. And once you are unaware of it, it still impacts the brain and it still impacts your decision making. So for example, I was in Greece a few years ago, before a lot of this financial trouble, and spoke to a group of people, and I asked them, how many of you are afraid? They were all CEOs, and everybody said, oh, not me. I'm not afraid. I cope, I'm strong, I know what I'm doing. And they were not consciously afraid, they were not lying. But when we did a test to see whether the unconscious and conscious brain were working well together, the test showed that there was a significant problem with how the brain was controlling what it needed to control in the audience, which then showed me that even though consciously people were not aware that their brains were not actually working in the way they needed them to work, unconsciously there was a lot going on that was compromising the brain. And you see this especially with strong leaders. And the problem with strong leaders is that strong leaders do not burn out early, they burn out later. So for them, they feel like they're coping, they feel like they don't realize that while they're coping, all these things are happening. So what the brain science does is, it shows these leaders why it is these unconscious fears can manifest, and then it gives us clues about what we can do to go into the brain and change the conscious brain that controls the unconscious, as well as accessing the unconscious brain directly. So we have very specific mechanisms. So one is in the management of stress and anxiety and fear. Secondly, we have paradigms in organizational agility that help us understand how to get people within the organization to become more agile. Now, in these economic times, There are constant changes that are going on. And a good leader realizes that they can't just make a 3-year plan and go through it. They sometimes have to have 2 to 3 month plans, and then they see the results and then they change their direction. Now, for a lot of people, changing so frequently can be very nerve-wracking. And the problem is, under stress, like the kind of stress that Greece is undergoing right now, certain brain switches are turned off. So you may think that you're making the right decision, but the truth is, even though you have the capacity to make the right decision, you don't really have the ability to, because the stress has turned your brain switches off. So what we can do is teach people how to turn specific brain switches for specific functions. So if you're an organization that needs to turn on the switches to become more agile, needs to know that, we can help you do that. A lot of times, like the times right now in Greece, one core competency that's needed, I think, is the ability to enhance your creativity and innovation. Because any kind of straight shooting solution doesn't really get you to the goal. What the brain science does is we know what the brains of creative people look like. And we know what you can do to turn on these creative switches. But the one thing I'll say is, none of this is an overnight solution. You just come and if you listen one time to how to be creative, you go home and you become really creative. I think, but what we do is we provide a frame, and then you can follow up with it. And I think what's particularly cool about what we're doing is, for certain paradigms, we don't actually have to always be there in person. We have the ability to introduce frames to people, and now we have some online software, so people can actually train themselves within the company once they have an understanding of how to do that. So the few examples are fear, agility, creativity. Another is change. People often think that, oh yeah, I can change. It's very easy. No, but it's not easy anywhere. For example, I'm actually doing a course today at Harvard Business School, on change. And I think people recognize that you can shift deck chairs in the Titanic. You can rearrange things so they look like you've actually changed. But the question is, have you changed deeply? Have you gone into your brain and changed the way your brain connections are? And what are some of the things that will help you get there? And how can you talk to your brain in order to get there? Now, sometimes people feel like, what's this got to do with business? But more and more, people are actually using this training in different countries. They're using it not just in business. They're using it in different settings in the army, where they're actually teaching people how to rewire parts of their brain. A lot of sports people use brain-based techniques to actually change what's going on in their brains.
When you play tennis, for example, you're very anxious when you have a match, or in every game where you are under some stress, so you have to change things when you are playing the game, isn't it? Yes.
And you have to know how to think about it as well. Like Serena Williams recently won. She won Wimbledon. She won 2 Olympic gold medals. She was in the U.S. Open, and in the U.S. Open she was 1 set all, and she was 3-5 down in the final set with 2 match points against her.
Yeah.
And when the interviewers asked her, what were you thinking when you were thinking, okay, this is probably gone? She said, I thought all sorts of things. I thought, how do I make my runners-up speech? I must remember to be nice in my runners-up speech. And then I just let all of that go out of my head, and I said to myself, I need 14 points to win. That's it.
That's it.